the focus for today's video is of course this amazing force of knights painted and delivered to me by my long-time channel sponsor Siege Studios. I will outline today for you the unofficial homebrew background I used as a basis to design this force. And if you're impressed by this initial showcase of knights, brace yourselves for Phase 2 coming up in 2024. Siege are a long-term sponsor for this channel and have been working with me since 2018. They help bring stability for me on the channel and in delivering lore videos to you all every month. I highly recommend a visit to their website where you can see many more examples of the amazing work they produce, and if you have a project coming up or in the near future, throw an inquiry over to them on their application form. It's all linked directly below this video, and all your inquiries help support me and the channel. Check them out at siegestudios.co.uk. Here on this channel, I focus mainly on the lore side of Warhammer 40,000, but this is of course not the only aspect to 40k, which in itself is one of the most interesting and appealing things about it as a verse. There's the lore brought to us through the novels, audiobooks and campaign material, plus the miniature side of things with the tabletop game itself and painting. You can of course choose to focus on a single aspect of 40k, but most often we see hobbyists enjoy a mix of these from the 40k verse. When I was a kid, about 70% of my Warhammer time was spent playing, maybe 20% painting, and only 10% the lore. As I became more interested and experienced in painting, this shifted to about 50-40 painting, playing, but still just 10 on the lore. The reason that I had so little time in the lore back then was firstly being quite young, but also because in the earlier days of 40k there simply was far less material to access it from. It was pretty much your Codex, White Dwarf, and that's it. The novels, the Heresy series, all of this came much later. But even back in this time, one of the most enjoyable aspects of 40k as a hobby was using your own imagination. And the game actively encouraged this. Improvised, scratch-built terrain for the battlefield, converting models, rules made up between friends to add some extra spice to the game. And while there has been ever more talk of late about the rules of 40k, how they're updated, how they're delivered to the community, I have heard more and more among fellow 40k YouTube enthusiasts, and especially some of the tabletop players that I know, that with the constant amending of rules and the points units, like I say, how they're delivered and how quickly, that many people are returning to more what is lovingly referred to as garage hammer, referring to the kind of games we all play at home, in your garage, your dining room for the day, likely deciding between friends. Do we really agree with this rule? No? Okay, we'll just skip it for this game. Or hey, what about if for this game we make it so that anyone coming within 4 inches of these spiky ball plants would just take D3 mortal wounds? It's actually something I see fairly infrequently commented upon online on social media, that actually if everybody decides on the day how they want to play, that's okay. And I've only been reminded by this when I've often rediscovered some of my own custom creations as a kid. Some of you remember my Nurgle Lord, who 12-year-old me apparently envisioned giving people what I described on his datasheet as an acid hug, which allowed him to reabsorb mass from an enemy and regain wounds. Seems fine, totally legit. Or my creation of the rarely seen pattern of triple bolter. Overall, the point is, any game is the most fun when you're a little creative with it. Add some extra spice to increase the flavour of the game. There's no reason people cannot continue that spirit today. Create your own secondary objectives, make up rules for terrain. Can some of it be destroyed? You used to be able to destroy terrain completely in the second edition of 40k. If you decide you want to today, why not? If some enemy units are hiding behind terrain and sitting on an objective, just destroy the terrain and then you can shoot them. It seems honestly silly that when your Castellan Knight with its Plasma Decimator and Volcano Lance are staring at a very large but also thin metal silo, could not just destroy it by either walking through it or with a single shot incinerate it and open up the line of sight for your whole force. Many people of course go beyond just small rule modifications and create entire homebrew Space Marine chapters, Orc clans, Necron dynasties, Chaos warbands, and yes, Knight households, and often that enables them to use any of the rules in the books as they are written, or to create their own custom rules if they're playing games with friends out of a official sort of tournament environment. So imagine my surprise some years ago, as you know, when I discovered the bizarre coincidence that there is a planet in 40k known as the Luetin Necropolis. I had to actually check up on this to ensure it was a real thing, but it is, first appearing in the 5th edition Space Wolf Codex and later in the short audio drama and short story Death Wolf. However, there was very little information about the world other than its title as a necropolis. As you may recall in my first video, I was so surprised by this that I decided I wanted to create some kind of homebrew force and lore for the world, to create some of my own custom tabletop armies from, specifically sororitas, knights, and who knows, maybe some Imperial Guard in the future. And as we see today, my Knight household just passed its first stage of completion, thanks to Siege Studios. My sororitas army is underway, and my next project once I complete the last stages of my Necron force I'm working on right now. But when creating your own force, where do you begin? For me, before I even began to design the Knight colour scheme, or the sororitas for that matter, I needed to understand them. I needed to know their characters, their background, what occurred with them. And to do this, you need to build some unofficial homebrew background for them. Now, some people may think that's unnecessary, but in actuality I find it to be extremely helpful in designing a force, and I know friends who are big painters in 40k who also would agree that it's helpful to sort of know a background, because that can help in how you design and embellish individual miniatures. Creating anything from scratch is always a challenge. There's nothing more intimidating than being given a blank sheet of paper and told, okay, go. Because where do you even begin? Creating a backstory for your Necromunda gang, your 40k army, your Titanicus Legio often leads to decisions along the line which will help inform you about designing a leader for your force, the kinds of weaponry they might favour, their combat style. All of this will most likely pull you deeper into the immersion of the game, the project, your passion, to also see it through to completion. So today I'll showcase for you my Knight household, Luetin of the Luetin Necropolis. Within the unofficial lore I created as a background for my tabletop armies, the Knights and sororitas both connect to the world, but at different stages in the planet's history. As today we're focused on the Knight side of things, this will cover some of the early history of the planet and the war which set events in motion that would lead to it becoming a necropolis and favoured by some sisters of the sororitas. It was crazily 4 years ago now that I outlined the rough overall picture of what I imagined for the background of my forces, who hailed from the world known as the Luetin Necropolis. But in order to do this, I needed to imagine to myself how the world could have developed. This to me is very important in developing an actual homebrew army, because as I said, without any background it can be more difficult to make unit choices, certainly colour schemes and additional embellishment details, names of characters, and I think their overall motivations. Plus it really adds a lot to the feel and passion for a new force. I think it's very much part of the hobby of 40k in creating and using your own imagination. A side note, some of what we look at today was covered in my first Luetin Necropolis video, but we sift through it in more detail. But please do go check out that first video if you want to be up to speed. It's linked on screen now, as we will get into the background of the Knight household in the chapters after this. For how I imagined the planet's story to function, I wanted it to be part of a system of worlds, and I called this the Riva system, comprising of 5 planets, 2 feudal, 1 hive world which specialised in mineral extraction, a garden planet and a feral world. In the earlier period of M15 to M25, it would develop as a colony with mineral extraction enabling it to become a successful exporter, which also enabled industrial fabrication. Over time and pre-Age of Strife, knights began to appear as they did over many worlds. This then inevitably leads to a shift in the political structure of the world toward a system of noble households ruling, collectively forming what would become known as House Varada, who rule from the 3rd planet Luetin with its large cities and mining. During the Age of Strife, as upon many Night worlds, things are kept relatively stable, although upon looting 2 successful proto-hive cities are believed to have been lost. According to surviving records, there are originally 5 hive cities, but although they are recorded as having existed, the 2 lost cities and status are unknown. They have been proven as no longer visible from orbit despite repeated surveys. In the period of M30, the system emerges largely unscathed compared to others who are entirely ravaged by the horrors of the Warp and the Xenos during the Age of Strife. Soon after, the system comes under Imperial control. The Riva system is not tactically significant and so suffers no major battles during the heresy, but in the aftermath painfully extensive purges still occur to satisfy Imperial bureaucrats and later Inquisitors. It is then assessed at a later date and assigned a clear status. However, the planet's noble household structure has fractured as a result of the distrust and general suspicion which took hold not uncommonly for the heresy period. Upon looting, each city now has its own noble household, with the 3 houses bearing the name of each of their namesake hive cities, Riva, Falia and Luetin. The world continues deep mining and resource production again, with each house attempting to compete now with the other in mineral production to prove to the wider Imperial authorities that they are best suited to lead both the planet and the system. The Imperium takes note of this unusual situation, but it appears to be initially beneficial, with each noble household pushing high levels of extraction and production. They allow the competitive situation between the house nobility of each hive to continue. But the Imperium sends an administrator to act as an overseer and ombudsman to adjudicate if decisions affecting the entire system cannot be agreed between the 3 houses, and to generally remind them that an authority above their own dominions exists. By mid-M32, the system enters a period they refer to as the Age of Isolation. Just prior to this, the state of affairs between the hive cities' ruling families has been becoming progressively more aggressive and counterproductive. Shipments are missed, resources wasted, even some individuals disappearing within the hive cities. The deteriorating situation leads the Imperial Overseer to report on all of this. Soon after, a new Imperial Governor is installed to manage the disruption between the houses. But before any new regulations or penalties can be implemented, things deteriorate further. What is determined later to be a case of brazen sabotage sees an Imperial freighter delivering mineral resources to a forge world explode whilst it is offloading, causing significant damage and drawing further attention from the tech priests and broader Imperial observers. An edict is issued removing the power of the houses, and to fully emphasise the point, all 3 High Kings are summarily executed. The new governor remains, but they were initially assigned to the position for their prowess in managing trade disputes. And things have already become more tense than a trade dispute, even while the noble houses remain outraged by what they see as gross overreach by the Imperium. Contact is lost with the system. It appears that a powerful warp storm has enveloped the region, affecting several systems, and all communication is lost. The planets are now entirely cut off and can only travel locally within the system for resources and support. The situation is only made worse still as reports of orc sightings appear on the Luetin hive world, with their arrival later determined as having likely broken away from a larger orc force, perhaps in the hopes of gathering up easy scrap for some ongoing war. And this is a common occurrence for orc fleets, where a small group may splinter off and end up on a world, initially landing a distance away from Imperials on the other side of a planet or into an abandoned hive world, for example, and only later, when the orcs begin to become more established, is it realised how big of a problem is presenting itself. Or of course they may just barrel straight into the middle of a hive city. This new governor, Avavor, is thrown very much into the thick of it, and dispatches an emergency ship in an attempt to make contact with the Imperium, but the vessel is never heard from again. Subsequent ships are sent to try and escape the system, but quickly return to report they are now unable to enter warp space. No matter what caused the disturbance, the consequence is that now they are completely isolated and unable to receive any assistance from the wider Imperium. Faced with scouring an orc infestation, a problem Governor Avavor is entirely unsuited to, and only made more difficult by continually inaccurate assessments of combat readiness from the planetary militia, who are unknown to him, long out of experience for such a problem, and only made worse by the advice of equally inexperienced officers, Governor Avavor decides to send out 2/3 of the planet's defensive militia, who have little more than basic training, but who are to be led by the First Army of Regular Guard, consisting of veterans. Unfortunately, these veterans are in name only, having been stationed on a backwater planet their entire lives, many of whom are far from being in their prime, and veteran referring more to their age than anything else. Still, they will be aided by a solid number of the knights from House Riva, where the governor is situated, and these knights will become the only real thing that stands between the human militia and total annihilation. Instead of taking the time though to develop a more coherent defensive strategy, digging significant and more well-established defensive lines closer to the Hive City, it leaves the Imperials overstretched. Communication lines are difficult, and only the knights prevent total disaster, despite the fact they're taking heavy losses themselves. The missteps of the leadership are how a campaign aimed to conclude in a few weeks drags on for over a month. Human losses are significant, with some frontline battles suffering as high as 80% casualties. Additionally, each Orc assault has generally been seen to increase in strength and aggression. The front lines have devolved into a labyrinthine mass of improvised trench lines. Many large holes exist along the line, communications are sporadic, the quality of intel poor. The leadership of House Riva, with its significant losses, are becoming ever more enraged and demand a new approach. Their prayers seem to be answered when in the coming weeks the Orcs strangely begin to slow the frequency of their attacks, a sign presumed by officials they're doing something right. Perhaps in desperation, the Knights of Riva also see this as a positive sign, when experience and understanding of the enemy could suggest otherwise. This shift in circumstance unfortunately emboldens the governor to send out the remaining PDF along with many of the remaining Knights of House Riva to crush what must be, to his mind, a progressively weakened Orc force. The rationalization being that despite their losses being so high, they also had staved off defeat, and thus presumably the Orcs have suffered as much as the defending militia, as demonstrated by their weakened attacks of late. It's a disastrous mistake, as the Orcs had in actuality simply been pulling Orc power to construct their increasingly sizable mechs and scrap acquisition. Before they have a chance to turn back, the Imperial force is all but destroyed. The ensuing blood-crazed Orcs lead a massive counter-assault against a poorly defended Hive Riva, allowing them to consume the city. The shock and humiliation of this disaster forces the governor to flee to the second Hive, Falia, with his advisors explaining authoritatively how they now expect the Orcs to slow down. They will be preoccupied consuming the materials of Hive Riva, and thus giving them time to plan, reinforce for a decisive counter-offensive. This prediction does not occur. Instead, the Orcs push forward with a voracious, furious momentum in what would become known as the Great Deluge. In my original video we continued on through the rest of the timeline, but today is where we pivot more specifically into the Knights of the World, the resolution overall, and how the Night House of Luetin would emerge to become the primary authority for the planet. As noted, originally within the system of Riva, there was a singular house which oversaw the defense of all its planets, and they were known as Virada. It remains unclear which came first, the House of Virada or the Knights in the system, as records from this time were lost during Old Night. But it's reasoned by the current nobility that when colonists first arrived in the system, eventually when the Knights, or whatever term they used for these constructs, were of course used to protect, gather resources, and traverse the planet safely. We know that these machines eventually began to create changes in their pilots through their thrones, leading to more feudal and monarchical outlooks. And this perhaps explains why several of the worlds within the Riva system remained as feudal worlds. Regardless of how it began though, knights have been a permanent feature upon feudal worlds as they are for those of the Riva system, all of which pledge fealty to the ruling house on the core planet of Luetin. Before the contemporary time though existed Virada, and what was once a powerful unified house covering the whole system, responsible for all knights within the nobility. But in the aftermath of the heresy, which saw widespread disruption across the Imperium, fractures would emerge that were apparently too significant to heal, and so the house would split between each hive city across the worlds. The divided houses though now pledge their allegiance to noble rulers within each hive, as we said, Riva, Filia and Luetin, with each house continuing to declare that it is they who hold the ultimate authority to reunify the nobility under their own banners. But this localized disruption and competition does not cause a significant enough problem for Imperial involvement to resolve. Later though, during the campaign of the Orcs, the remaining knights are consolidated by circumstance as part of one house. This event, it seems, was only possible due to an appearance of a Freeblade knight who had travelled into the Riva system before its warp storm isolation. Although the addition of an independent noble, especially a Freeblade, into an existing house was an unusual move, their independent position after centuries of internal squabbles and vendettas, plus the Freeblade's inspirational fighting skills that led to saving the remaining Hive City, would solidify the prospect of them as a respected leader within the nobility of the Knight House, additionally enabling all other knights to be able to, for the most part, put aside their differences and enable them to save face. In the generations to come, any remaining hostilities would dissipate, not least due to the Imperium continuing to consolidate its power upon the planet and system. Upon the world of Luetin, the period of conflict which saw the Xenos assault 2 Hive cities is referred to as the Great Deluge. In its aftermath, 2 of the 3 Hive cities were functionally destroyed, leaving the scattered remnants of the Knight Houses who had existed there, and those whose names are now rarely if ever spoken of, emerging from ruined hives either into the wastelands or opting for an end of their own choice, throwing themselves knowingly into the brutal fighting amid the skeletal inferno of their hive superstructure. In the earliest days of their arrival, the Orcs soon discovered that they were unable to leave this planet, something that had apparently not readily been a thought in their mind when arriving, so they would make the best of a bad job and settle in. Orc scrap towns began to appear along the lateral continental region adjacent to the hive cities of Riva and Luetin, and sure enough, over time the Orcs began to periodically launch assaults against Imperial defensive lines, and inevitably also out of boredom began fighting against themselves to gain better control of resources, i.e. which scrap heaps yielded the best scraps. As noted before, the Imperials had a truly disastrous beginning, suffering horrifying losses as each progressive Orc attack proved stronger than the last. But with the help of the Riva Knights, they still found themselves holding the front lines. These reports, unfortunately though, led to the planet's governor making this huge miscalculation, committing all his remaining PDF and a sizable contingent of Riva Knights to go on an all-out offensive to destroy what they thought was left of these diminished Orc forces. This was of course not the case. The Orcs were as strong as ever, and the subsequent annihilation of the remaining Knights and Hive militia led to a rage-fueled counter-offensive from the Orcs, only made worse by the emergence of a new war boss known as Ozcan, which created the optimal formula for an unstoppably brutal advance from the Orcs. Bizarrely, they had also constructed huge drills mounted atop caterpillar tracked vehicles to drill straight through the surrounding topography so as to allow their mechs to just stomp over the challenging terrain. The insatiable Orc drillers achieved this feat in only a few days, and their mechs, which have been previously held back by their natural land features, now have a clear path to the first Hive City, the namesake of the system itself and the headquarters for the governor and his command staff, Hive Riva. Riva is overrun by an almighty deluge of Orc violence. An internal breakdown in communications also means that the governor and senior members who were receiving urgent reports of approaching Orc war were too busy planning the big picture effort to consider informing the lowly guard defenders on the city perimeter, who only know of the approaching Orcs when they literally see them, leaving them barely time to organise and mobilise any heavy support before they are quite often literally crushed under the weight of what has now become a full-blown war. Governor Avavor and some of his command are so panicked by the ferocity of the assault and the near complete loss of their defences within hours that as soon as the inner defences are breached, they decide to escape the hive, leaving due in part to the words of Avavor stating callously that it's already a lost cause. The enraged remnants of Knight House Riva are left to fend for themselves, but the city falls within 24 hours to the Orcs. A final messenger and communications from House Riva are sent to the Knight households of Filia and Luetin, informing them of what has taken place. Governor Avavor's arrival at Hive Filia is not a welcome one, but the rationalization given is that he has fled only so that he can have some time to plan a counter-assault and retake Hive Riva. It still does not sit well with those of Hive Filia, who have plans of their own. The governor and his officials' rationalization, though, is that the Orcs will surely now spend time stripping the fabrication works of Hive Riva to enable them to construct new war machines. They'll cannibalize the wreckage of this huge assault, thus enabling the Imperials to capitalize on this distraction and win a decisive victory. Unfortunately, Avavor yet again fails to understand that by now the Orcs are so hyped up on their war after their almost unopposed crushing victory that they do not want to stop fighting for anything. War boss Ozcan barely has to give an order and the Orcs roll out with enthusiastic momentum toward Hive Filia. Its defences, while considerably more substantial and organised than Riva and fully aware of what could be coming their way, are still caught entirely off guard by the severity and speed of the assault. Not least because the governor had instructed them that they would certainly have plenty of time for reinforcing defences. While the knight household of the city begin laying the failures directly at him in a series of heated debates, they set to work transporting materials into the Hive City, but were still in the midst of making these constructions themselves when the Orc assault arrived. A solid number of the city's militia were not even manning defences, leading some positions to become immediately overwhelmed. The knights storm forward with an entire household to defend the city compared to the remnants of House Riva. The city fares better, but even with the Knights of Filia fighting with everything they have, the Orc stompers and mech gargants saturate the battlefield. Within a few days, a heavy fog of war machine exhausts have created a nightmarish war zone of strange klaxons roaring through dark fogs, of mechs stomping through a dense fog blanket surrounding the hive base, while lakes of stagnant blood spill over through the trench lines. Beasts of green skin wander in packs, tearing apart any humans they encounter. Some defenders manage to retreat to the base of the hive and dig in, shoring up its secondary line of defences, but in many instances even these become quickly overrun. The governor and his command staff, who at this point both reticent to abandon yet another hive city to the Orcs so quickly, but are also fearful to interact directly with the nobles and other members of the city's militia, lock themselves away high in the spire, attempting to enact last-minute orders as their list of catastrophic failures is now mounting. But the noble house leadership have had enough, and are already assessing the situation with an outlook that is grim. Their plans considerably more extreme and certainly apathetic toward their own existence than those of the governor, because they place avoiding ceding power or territory to the Xenos above all other objectives. Unbeknownst to the governor, House Filia are considerably more xenophobic than those of Riva and Luetin. This is attributed to some occurrence during the Age of Strife. In its current High King plans to follow their family creed to the letter, which stated that should their house and city ever face the prospect of becoming tarnished by the disgrace of becoming a noble house who could ever allow such Xenos filth to control or bring down their city, their obligations require no debate or consideration, their consciences should remain entirely clear. The High King of Filia gives out his final order, a self-destruct command to the House Overseers of the Atomic Guild. Billions die instantly as its reactors are manually overloaded and go critical. The Hive is completely annihilated in a nuclear shockwave, with the vast majority of its population destroyed. The area surrounding the Hive is hit by a colossal blast and incinerated in an inferno. The surviving planetary command staff, including Governor Avavor, are now instantly vaporized, and the Orcs take severe losses themselves. As many as 90% of their largest mechs are destroyed in the explosion, as well as enough of their strongest packs of boys to become now combat ineffective. The war boss and the heavily wounded remnants of the Orc mobs crawl back to Hive Riva, which now becomes their primary base of operation. Any Riva citizens have by now either been slaughtered or enslaved by the Orcs. A good number, though, of maybe some 0.5% have formed a resistance and are continually attempting to disrupt Orc operations from the Underhive and pockets of the Spire. The enslaved citizens are put to work by the Orcs deconstructing the Hive to enable them to build their new war machines. Boss Ozcan, though, has survived the apocalypse at Hive Filia, but was still severely wounded in the process. His mechs and docs have patched him up so that by the time he reaches Hive Riva, he's already revved up announcing that it is time for the orcs to
smash the stupid Umis. Did you grots not see it? They hit us with the beam fire, but we still keep cracking the skulls, boys. We're gonna build us a bigger, better Super Smasher Gargant.
After this stirring speech, he crushes a nearby grot who was too excited by this to be paying full attention to its impending demise, and the boss then uses its limp body as an improvised paintbrush, drawing a design for his Super Smasher Gargant on a nearby piece of sheet metal. It was revolutionary, an ingenious piece of design, as it was basically the mechs they had already built so far, but much bigger. Gabriel Brasov originally came to the planet of Luetin unintentionally. After waging unending vengeance upon those who had destroyed his former house of knights, who still remain nameless, he had been travelling the galaxy in search of Imperial worlds under the threat of Xenos attack. The system containing the mining world of Luetin had been one he intended to investigate or pass by, but after finding himself trapped by the warp storms, he was resolved to bide his time. Upon encountering the Knights of House Riva and Falir, he discovered his Freeblade status was very unwelcome, and so he decides to wait out his time here in contemplative isolation. After watching for months of miserable warfare, failures and one Hive city already toppled, he decides it's time to intervene. But the numbers of orcs facing down Hive Falir are clearly beyond hope of any defence. Still, he decides to present himself to the as yet unassailed Hive Luetin, but is given a frosty reception and turned away. But his intel regarding the soon-to-be overwhelmed Hive Falir outweighs any prejudices the Night House has, and they do agree to launch a reinforcement of Knights to Falir. Unfortunately, even as they're making the journey to reinforce the city, they see it destroyed in a truly massive atomic explosion. With little cause to progress further, the Knights of House Luetin return to the defence of their own city. But Brasov protests and argues they should attempt to rally survivors if any stand is to be made at all. The knights, who despite everything continue to remain bitterly loyal to their own houses, ignore him, and so he alone proceeds to locate any surviving knights of Hives Falir and Riva. As Hive Falir falls consumed by its own firestorm, some of the knights, apparently driven to madness, are charging back into the burning chaos, never to be seen again. Others form small improvised lances, rallied together on the outskirts of the wastelands which surround the remains of the Hive city, attempting to determine their best course of action. It was generally accepted that this battle was lost, but the fate of Hive Luetin was unknown, and some felt they could still aid the potentially sole remaining citadel. Many of the knights felt that this was a betrayal and that they should remain and continue to fight for their ruined Hive cities, that they were honour bound to carry out this task even if it meant the destruction of them all. There still could be pockets of citizens left throughout and in the Underhive. The surviving knights agree that this was the only acceptable recourse for them and turn to push back into the fire-engulfed smouldering remains. But as they set off to return to the city, an air-splitting unearthly siren was caught across the wasteland. As their senses scanned the horizon, the audio signature was identified as another knight. Yet it surely was not a knight of this world. It was a far older, ancient pattern of Sorestus Knight, a castigator. There were no known knights of this configuration among any of the noble houses upon the planet. A garbled, broken communication came through their vox systems. Brothers and sisters, I understand your pain, your loss, but your world can still endure. For House Luetin stands. The Hive needs you, and you can still have your vengeance, but only if you stand together. Stand with me now, join my Freeblade crusade, and become one of the Undefeated. The lone castigator knight revealed himself to be Gabriel Brasov, elaborating they were also known by the title, the Undefeated. They led a one-man crusade against all worlds threatened by the imminent or existent invasion of Xenos. The scattered knights of Hives Riva and Falir would, after some deliberation, rally under Brasov's Freeblade banner, at least until the conclusion of this campaign, as personal differences aside, they all well understood what was at stake on the world. and their individual qualms about working alongside rival households fell well below the priority of defending the planet from falling to the Xenos, especially one as abhorrent and offensive as the Orc menace. Working together under a Freeblade banner enabled them to rationalise working alongside those they had formerly held their grievances against. And Brasov assured them that if they stood alongside him, they would have a chance to regain their personal honour, and that once this oath was completed, they could choose to either stay with him or make their own way. The new Freeblade detachment would return to Hive Luetin, but with little welcoming fanfare on behalf of the city, certainly not by any members of the highborn knight household who considered these Freeblades to be all in a position of disgraced standing. As the war continued and losses mounted, the proud knights of House Luetin soon found that the Brasov Freeblades continued to fight with a fury and determination irrespective of their approval or condemnation, and with a success rate that somehow eluded them. This was their own hive, yet these strangers fought with more zeal and ferocity than they were able to muster in their own hearts. Where did they draw such power from, and how could they gain such spirit for themselves? Was it something only to be found after suffering the harrowing indignation that came from failure and dishonour? They may find out soon enough, as the Knights of House Luetin were slowly being ground down in what was now a protracted ground war. The Freeblades, under the direction of the Undefeated, took comparatively few losses, and where they returned wounded were still given facilities in the lower industrial area of the Hive City to be able to be recovered and patched up by the sacristans ready for battle once more. Their presence was something few of the ordinary citizens at this level could ever have expected to see, and so drew regular daily crowds who came to give praise and worship to the machines and knights. As across all Imperial worlds in the aftermath of the heresy, the growing cults of Imperial worship were emerging still in this time, and the Riva system was no exception. The High King of House Luetin, having been left in command of the Riva system now and its core world after the annihilation of all the command elements at Hive Philia, was facing increased pressure to make progress against the Orcs. It had become embarrassing to the House Knights that despite solid defences and still not facing significant numbers of Orc mechs, they were struggling to make notable victories. Meanwhile, the obscure but tolerated presence of the Freeblade Crusade only rubbed very welcome salt into their wounds, with the Freeblades scoring success after success and suffering few if any losses. Things would come to a critical juncture when a complete disaster would strike House Luetin during the later stages of the war with the Orcs. The noose had been tightening for weeks around the city, and the pressure to break out mounted on a daily basis. The High King of House Luetin would spearhead a mission he believed would deliver a crippling blow to the Orc battle lines that was meant to enable Imperial forces to flow out and assault the Orcs in a twin pincer movement, with his exalted court agreeing this could end the war. They were to focus upon a site where the Orcs were believed to have been building their gargantuan war machines. The High King issues ostentatiously a hive-wide statement that he and his exalted court will lead a determined assault against the most hardened Orc positions on the outskirts of Riva. He consults his commanders within the 9th Army, the 9th being the strongest of the three defending militia forces of Hive Luetin, which has been forced in the later stages of the war to become in fact a consolidation of the 8th, 9th and 10th armies simply to remain operational. A position is chosen to focus upon where it is believed the Orcs have been building their gargant war machines, and the Knights begin to move out, striding towards the Orcs of the surrounding wasteland. They launch forth, creating an imposing vision for the guardsmen watching from the Imperial lines, and the Knights seemingly face little opposition, easily obliterating any targets. However, once they are out of sight from the Imperial defences, pressing ever deeper through the wastelands, they find scattered, ruined Orc forms from scavenged metal, destroyed tanks, many rotting human carcasses. They are firmly into the Orc territory. And they soon begin to realise, as is typical through this campaign, their intel is woefully inaccurate. They're already encountering far more stompers and gargants than had been reported, which are for the most part stomping around, firing wildly in the rough direction of the Imperial lines, generally roaring, bashing into one another with their strange amplified voices. Now their centre arrays were lighting up like a strobe, detecting a far stronger presence of enemy than they had anticipated. The strange orc scrap machines were turning towards the knights and making what seemed to be gestures with their chainsword appendages. The first rounds began to hit the knights' ion shields, making it entirely clear there would be no element of surprise. A decision had to be made now whether to push on or retreat. Having personally formulated this assault, the High King of House Luetin felt an unavoidable sense of desperation and pressure. He was well aware that the Freeblade Knights had been fighting with more ferocity, more importantly having a significantly higher impact on the orcs than his own knights, and this embarrassing situation had to be resolved. To return having achieved nothing would be not only embarrassing, it could risk far more, potentially the security of his position itself. The High King declared that this would be their day of reckoning. He had faith in his closest knights, some of which were his direct heirs, and their accompanying attachment of vassals. Together they would save the honour of House Luetin and turn this war in favour of the Imperials. Striding out over the comms came his voice, "Imperium Victore!" Once the assault began, it became almost immediately apparent that their resounding victory was not going to happen. Worse among the knights chosen for the assault were supposedly some of the finest in House Luetin, yet they were all but obliterated. The High King himself would be unceremoniously pinned down by the ever more ferocious orc mechs who continued to just ram bluntly against his legs until he ungracefully toppled over. The big mech things and smaller ravenous orcs were all over him like a swarm of ants, carving him to pieces with their massive chained appendages or smaller hacking cleavers, saws and whatnot. Somehow a few pitifully tattered knights and armigers limped back to the city. The remaining members of the noble leadership assessed the Knights of Luetin and realised they now retained only 45% of its total strength. About half of that was badly damaged and unfit for battle. The city, its nobles and the Freeblades were out of time. The orcs had penetrated the Imperial lines and were estimated now to be approaching the city within days. Their bloodlust was, by all reports, in a state of frenzy from the annihilation of the knights. Despair and confusion quickly turned to panic and rage amid the hastily arranged discussions being held among the upper echelons of the highborn nobility in Hive Luetin. Governor Avavor and his leadership had been slaughtered, and now the High King of the House City and system were dead. The nobles agreed on one thing almost immediately: their house must survive. Its glorious reputation must not be sullied forever in the eyes of the Imperium. Yet the reality of the situation facing them seemed insurmountable. It was until one of the younger members within the noble household dared to voice an unthinkable suggestion. Had it been any other time, said sponsor of the proposal may have been dragged out of the room to face a brutal punishment, potentially even death. But instead his proposal was met with silence, a scattered mixture of disapproving murmurs, some screams of outrage, but what began as small numbers of applause drowned out any dissent as it rose to becoming a cascade of approval. The unthinkable proposal voiced will be an attempt to amalgamate the Freeblades into their house, critically positioning Gabriel Brasov as a new High King. Still, approving a proposal was one thing, enacting it quite another. Requesting Gabriel Brasov, leader of the Freeblades, to not only join them but lead them seemed a wildly unlikely situation to come to pass given all that had occurred so far. One of the few remaining barons of the Imperial Knight House Luetin was Baron Adek. It was agreed he would be sent to approach Brasov the Undefeated with the Highborn's proposal. They had wagered his age, seniority, and rough but plain diplomatic skills would be enough to forge what many still openly maintained would be an impossible alliance to make. More than a few nobles openly scoffed at this prospect, confidently exclaiming that Brasov would not even entertain such a suggestion, given how they had been treated so far. No self-respecting highborn could accept such an obviously insulting request. Please come to our aid, despite us having shunned and disrespected you so publicly until now. Still, there were no better suggestions forthcoming, despite some pathetic attempts to grab power by the weak and those thirsting under delusions of grandeur. Brasov was sent for to hold an audience with Baron Adek. It was unquestionably an unorthodox plan. And despite the rapturous approval of the majority, it was a decision that saw many bittered and soured faces amid the halls of the nobility. A sizable group of senior nobles clearly thought that this was not just a bad plan, but a disgusting insult that would taint their bloodlines forever. Yet those who choose to abstain from approving the decision had no alternative solutions. Whether they liked it or not, many agreed through gritted teeth that it was realistically this or the end. But as the nobles exited their great hall, many among them were whispering variations of, "I certainly would not disagree with you, sir, that this is most unpalatable to have such a renegade lead our great house, but have you considered that once we secure victory, well, who's to say what a noble house may choose to do then? My scouts within the Arbites who patrol the lower hive inform me that there are many excellent prospects of late signing on within my household's, well, let's call it a guild this annum. Maybe the time arrives to begin compiling a few names on the off chance we have need of their disappearing services. Wouldn't you say so?" The kind of assertions that met with many blusterous sounds of approval. But unlike those who were already plotting his demise, one of the highly respected barons of Knight House Luetin was Adek. He had as an impressive combat record as any of the senior knights, but was still nothing compared to Brasov and some of his most loyal, perhaps not court for Freeblades, but at least his closest followers. Upon hearing the statement upon the scroll which bore the high seal of House Luetin as read by Baron Adek, Gabriel Brasov's laughter roared through the sacristan forge shrine. Appreciating the seriousness of the situation, he quickly regained his composure and his face became gravely ashen. He would eventually come to speak with a calmly dispassionate tone. "What a pitiful proposal you present to me, Adek. How is it you expect me to not take personal offence considering your sheer brazen audacity? I genuinely thought better of you, but no longer. Why should my crusading Freeblades be thrown upon the funeral pyre of your own making? We fight with you now and to this point because we must. Your king threw away his finest warriors for nothing. I had hoped to save this world, this planet, but it seems it is irredeemable, and this last action only confirms this for me. Do I and my knights just abandon our oaths and the broader goals we have sworn to achieve? There are many worlds out there who could require our assistance, and they undoubtedly do not see such embarrassingly woeful decisions from their most venerated leaders. I cannot leave this world today, but I would rather a chance for tomorrow than to die in a grave dug for me by those who would not accept my help when it could have made a difference. What made your household offer this to me, Adek? A final insult? That we walk hand in hand to our glorious deaths? The Knights of Luetin, by any measure, barely deserve to carry its own name, and in the days to come, it is surely to be crushed by a horde of filthy greenskins. It's a disgrace. I know your kind, Adek. I've seen it before." Brasov took a longer than comfortable pause, staring into space, as if lost in some distant reverie. "You say you fight in defense of your world, but I've seen the truth of it ever since I arrived on this forsaken planet. Yours an embittered house, and your kind only fighting for your name." "That is not so," protested Adek, raising his voice, but also painfully knowing in his heart there was some truth to the insult. Brasov simply ignored him and continued talking over him. "My house was the same, Adek, long ago. Long ago. I forget how long. And look what it got them. Annihilation. They are not remembered. The world I knew was lost. I vowed to spend the rest of my existence fighting to prevent such horrors from those who deserved it, those who resisted and fought as one. Those who forget their reason for being, who dishonour their oaths, are the means of their own destruction, Adek. In honesty, who can even say how conscious we even are to such a shift in priorities? The thrones are mysterious. None of us truly know how they have affected our families over the millennia. Piloting our machines of war is not enough. We must retain control of their spirits, just as does the Princeps. I am certain you do not even believe my words, Adek, and I understand, but I have seen the decisions you make on the battlefield. I have watched your knights. To yourselves, you will not even feel as if you're being forced to hesitate, but you are. I've seen it. How else do you account for the differences in our losses? It's the downfall of your king himself, and you should take comfort in that, Adek. Your house has become softened by centuries, indeed millennia, of stability and comfort, Adek, where once the nobles felt the pressure, the importance to survive. That strength of will has deserted you. You may not feel it, but it is there. Your kind look down upon us Freeblades, Adek. You should be lying prostrate begging me for your salvation. You think we are dishonourable. Let me tell you, Baron, on this world the Freeblades stand for much more than a name, much more than our machines. We stand in defence not of your nobility or this hive, but for this planet and for the Imperium. And you ask me to stand now in defence of a name that has proven itself entirely worthless thus far. Do you see now how laughable it is that you would voice such an insulting proposition to me? I and my knights will fight to the death. We will fight for the Imperium and for the Emperor, save the city if we can. But tell me, Baron Adek, why in the name of terror do you believe that we, should fight for your house name with myself as your High King? Answer me that. Not what you have been brought here to tell me on your scrap of expensive paper. Tell me, why do you believe I should fight for the House of Luetin? Brasov stared hard into the eyes of the Baron before returning to his previous task, filing down some metal that he was placing within a sub-layer of the knight's plating, while numerous sacristans continued oiling, repairing other plates, and servicing his knight's ancient weaponry. Baron Adek took some time to compose himself after this barrage of a speech that he had felt unable to interrupt, and left him with the disturbing feeling that what Brasov was telling him was largely true. He had witnessed his knights making momentary errors that caused them to fall. He couldn't be certain, but he felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. It was not a feeling that allowed him to dismiss these accusations as the ramblings of a renegade. Had he, his fellow knights, even the High King, become imperceptibly too comfortable that it was even affecting their combat effectiveness? You hope to present me with some self-evident assessments, Gabriel, but let me give you some of my own. You Freeblades, you think only what is in front of you, and perhaps it is this that makes you the Undefeated. You're focused, yes, unrelenting, aggressive and masterful in your skills. But do you consider for a moment that you have spent so long looking solely upon what stands before you, the Xenos that must be destroyed, your oaths that must be upheld, your desire to prove yourself honourable once again? You said it yourself. You think only of these things. If the city falls, it falls. You will fight elsewhere and claim they were more deserving. Is it this that allows you to remain as you choose to see it, focused? It's true it brings you success on the battlefield, but once that objective is secured, do you never stop to look back at the aftermath left behind? Or do you push forward, seeking new fights, new battles, new challenges? Does it numb your pain, Gabriel? Brasov had no response to this rambling, but he was visibly clenching his teeth and began to stare bitterly through the Baron as Adek continued. What do you think you're fighting for, Gabriel? You tell me that it's for the Imperium of Man, to avenge your world. You fight for the Emperor himself. Where is the Emperor, Gabriel? Has he chosen to abandon us? Did we not fight well enough to deserve support, left here to suffer a miserable death? I know that you believe in the Emperor, Gabriel. Look around you. Our almighty Emperor could intervene, save us if he truly wished. You believe that he is a god, do you not? I've seen your kind before too, Gabriel, just as you have seen my house, the faithful. They have all abandoned us. We can only look to ourselves for salvation. Or is your crusade not your salvation, Brasov? Is it your penance to the god Emperor for your failure to defend your own world? You should watch your tongue, Adek, Brasov replied sharply. If this were any other time, Baron, and I know this world still lacks the faith that I and many others have come to accept on thousands of worlds in our Imperium, I could declare your speech heresy, and that would be the end of you. You know why the Imperium does not help us, Adek. Don't be so absurdly impertinent to suggest that they would leave us here by choice. Everyone knows the warp is disturbed. Nothing can leave or enter this system. We're adrift in the galaxy, lost beyond all sight. You say that the Emperor has abandoned us. How did I come to find myself here at this place and this time? You have little faith, Adek. So you maintain at least, interrupted Adek, leaving Brasov a little taken aback. Was this man in fact one of the faithful? Gabriel continued. I know you see that my being here clearly is not by chance. He was my guide to this place. He showed me this world. He guides my fate as he does all of us. So let me ask you then, Gabriel. If it were the Emperor's will that you find yourself here, you must have considered he may have intended a higher purpose for you beyond just waging war. What do you think will happen to this world and this system if the Knights of the sole remaining hive are left leaderless and broken? I'll tell you exactly what will happen, Gabriel. All will be destroyed. I concede that the barons of the house cannot alter our fate, including myself. This is why we come before you. These orc. They fight like none we have ever seen. Their machines of war are crude, yet seem unstoppable. They break us as if we were toy soldiers to them. We need not suffer another defeat to know that our house is already shattered, even if we collectively prevail over the Xenos. But still, you display the same hubris that condemned my own king to his death. Still, you will not stand with us. We need a leader, Gabriel. If by some miracle we can prevail, what awaits us? If we cannot stand together, we would be left waiting for the Imperium to inevitably install another governor. And what would you do, Gabriel, having fulfilled your oath to the Emperor? Leave us all in ruin? Yes, go ahead, Gabriel Brasov. Leave the planet to its ruin, all your fighting having counted for absolutely nothing. Have you considered how long it will be before any of us can leave this system? How many years will we be confined here? Even centuries? A millennia? You could help us now, to survive. That means more than winning a battle. It means a new beginning, restructuring and inspiring a house that, as you said, is worthy of its own name, and that unites the city itself. A house that stands ready to enact the will of your saviour, the Emperor of mankind, not just here, but out there, beyond this world. Would you not wish to be remembered for that? Remembered for not appearing once in the history of scattered worlds, but in one place, for all time, as a knight who regained his honour, became the saviour of not just a hive world, but of an entire system. You can become a symbol of faith for your Emperor, and his will, his power, still. Or will you instead remain content to sit upon your own throne, your free-blade throne, deluding yourself with the grandeur you never truly possessed, suppressing the memories of whatever destroyed remnants of your past you cling to, a forgotten life left far behind, blackened by the abject failures that left you with no choice than to become a free-blade? Gabriel Brasov's fist tightened, and his teeth audibly gritted on hearing his past used against him in such a clumsy and simplistic manner. But he relaxed his fist. He was not about to strike a baron of a house, not even now. He was still a highborn, not some hot-headed commoner in a darkened alehouse, ready to resort to violence at the slightest provocation. He had the dignity of a knight within him, and wasn't about to compromise it for the likes of those who had shown him little respect, or even for themselves in battle, even if Adek deserved to be knocked to the floor for his rambling assertions. Think about what we leave behind us, Gabriel. The most challenging battle is not always the one which lies directly before us. Adek placed the unique crest seal ring of the High King between them and turned to walk away, without waiting for an answer from Gabriel Brasov. You do not need to consider the right choice, Gabriel. I have my faith in the Emperor, just as you claim to. Yet if you truly have faith, then you must know that the choice is not ours to make. We merely serve the will of the Emperor of all mankind, and he has most certainly determined your fate, to be here with us and now. Gabriel Brasov looked down at the simple gold ring with its red seal of the House of Luetin mounted atop. He would remain alone within the sacristan forge shrine, sitting in the shadow of his colossal Cerestus knight for the rest of that night. He was certain he had been manipulated into this position, that much was obvious. Yet he had all but admitted himself that he had been brought here at the behest of the Emperor, albeit by means of some blurred vision. He picked up the ring and climbed into his knight. Such a decision could not be made by him alone. He needed the clarity of his throne, and they would decide together. The following day, Gabriel Brasov would be sworn into the noble house of Luetin as the leader of their Imperial Knights, High King Gabriel Brasov. He would also be placed in absolute command of the Hive City, its military forces, and the other planets throughout the system. He began his reign with a stirring speech declaring that where once he was solely known as the Undefeated, now they all in the house would be remembered forever as the Undefeated for the actions they were about to unleash against their enemy. They would vanquish their green-skinned foe, and the House of Luetin would never again allow such barbaric animals to threaten this world. The orcs were ultimately, of course, defeated, but that will form part of the next video I want to look at when we explore the remaining militia defences, a specialist force of guard known as the Karas, and events that would transition the planet into a world of faith. Several months after the final major battle against the Orc menace on Luetin, the Xenos are declared to be defeated. Promethean purge squads are quickly assembled in the aftermath and sent out with guard escorts to burn away the physical remains of orcs surrounding Hive Luetin. A regiment of engineers, along with a significant detachment of House Knights and Imperial Guard, are sent to Hive Riva. It remains infested with lesser orcs and its citizenry are now all but ruined, but a small resistance group, on hearing the approaching knights, fight a brief battle and freeing a total of around 50,000 citizens. Transports are then requested for these to be brought back and quarantined around the outskirts of Hive Luetin. The engineers proceed to set a series of firebombs all around the base structure of Hive Riva, and it burns for months, consuming the entire hive until nothing is believed to be left alive within its structure. In the years that follow, the title of the Undefeated would become the house motto for the knights and the wider house within the Hive city. High King Brasov would continue to train the knights he had collected from the ruined hives on the planet, as well as the broken remnants of House Luetin. His tactical doctrines quickly turned the tide for the Imperials, enabling them to suffer few losses. His legendary reign continued after the war with the Orcs. He would remain as Addic proclaimed, and in doing so they were able to consolidate their forces, rebuilding much of their strength, also producing great armories of material for ongoing maintenance. Across roughly the next decade, Brasov demonstrated not merely military prowess, but reform programs and ideological outlooks which steadily bled into the nobility, continuing to frustrate many of the older members of the nobility by his consistent approvals for the redistributions of house wealth toward ministorum and general welfare projects in the mid and even base hive levels, as well as projects to improve defences around the hive city itself. As was typical in the Hive nobility, he encountered several poorly planned assassination attempts which quickly exposed the perpetrators. However, in the year 559 M32, shortly before the planet would re-emerge and make contact with the Imperium, one of his long embittered enemies within the nobility, who had never fully accepted him as an outsider gaining such power over their own household, attempted a brazen assault upon him that was later said to be driven by sheer jealousy and frustration. It took place in plain sight, and even as Brasov would shatter the pathetically weak noble to the ground, crushing his body in a defiant act of unnecessary display that was no doubt intended as a warning to others who might challenge him, amid all the confusion, none would see the shadowed assailant approaching through the crowd of nobles. A digital weapon is discharged, and Brasov is critically wounded. The would-be assassin, a member of an old rival household, was dragged away for months of torturous revenge at the hands of the knights in Sacristan. Gabriel Brasov remained close to death, with all attempts to improve his stability resulting in little positive effect. They desperately resort to using his knight and the throne to keep him stable enough to work upon. But this can only hold him in the short term. Members of the Mechanicus eventually augment him to a point of stability, but despite this, it is decided the best course of action is for him to be interred permanently within his knight. Its systems are modified in the short term to keep his life support system stable, but what had been intended as a temporary measure is now being adapted by the few technicians within the higher nobility, collaborating with the rare site of Mechanicus tech priests present in the city itself in order to adapt a longer-term solution for Brasov. They give assistance in saving Gabriel Brasov, but on the understanding they will be allowed to explore the planet in detail, as they believe there exists the possibility of lost archaeotech within the undiscovered cities of the planet that have not been seen since before the Age of Strife, thus leaving now a small contingent of tech priests established upon the world through to M41. The Knights of House Luetin continue to patrol the wastelands between the ruined hive cities, accompanied by guard and militia forces. Should the Imperium request the 9th Army of the Luetin Necropolis to be deployed in an off-world campaign, there is always the possibility that Brasov, the Undefeated, may choose to attend with a detachment of knights, for when supported by such indomitable figures, it will inevitably lead to a crushing defeat for the enemies of mankind. As for the orcs, they were not seen within the wastelands for millennia, but reports are still filed regularly describing the purging of small nests of squigs and gretchen discovered within the ruins of Hive Riva. Despite repeated firebombing purges, the threat of their resurgence remains ever present. As is often the case, it may be that the orc threat is never fully removed from the planet, but the Knights stand vigilant and sworn to never allow such unholy filth to ravage again the world now known as the Luetin Necropolis. As Gabriel Brasov was gravely wounded and now entombed within his Castigator Knight, instructed his house to not place its complete loyalty upon a single leader. The path to destruction lay in the arguments over power that had caused their fractures in the past, so it was deemed necessary to create an overseeing noble council that could govern in the place of Brasov, and who could still counsel with him where necessary, which remained possible but would become progressively more difficult over time. Brasov decreed that the council would never be led by an individual, instead he would place his 3 Baron Kingswood in this role, for none are more loyal or wise than the defenders of the High King himself, for they can only achieve such positions after many years of devout loyalty, hard-won respect and great experience within their house and system. These 3 barons would help to ensure that any matters of general importance requiring a decision immediately would not be held up by endless bureaucracy. They would sit as heads of the wider system interests, overseeing the needs of various guilds, ecclesiastical interests, and the export requirements of the Riva system and Hive Luetin. All of this is of course simply to aid in the day-to-day activities and general bureaucratic administration of the system, its stability and the orders of the Imperium. The ultimate authority upon the world remains with Gabriel Brasov, which seems unlikely given the immense amount of time to have passed, but the unforeseen consequences of his assassination event would, ironically and frustratingly for his enemies in the nobility, see Gabriel Brasov's life extended exponentially, as he would now continue to serve the nobility within his Sorestus Knight as he has done for millennia, even though much of his time has been spent in stasis. The tech priests managed over time to link his throne as his knight sits within the Sacristan Forge Shrine to a 3-dimensional projection system, which creates a holographic representation of the High King up in his court whilst it is in session in the uppermost areas of the Hive City. Because of the High King's permanent residence within the Forge Shrine, it has been heavily reinforced, guarded continually by knights and elite selected members of personal Imperial Guard regiments who patrol the areas surrounding the forge above and below at all hours. As a result of the previous assassination attempt though, any individuals entering the King's Forge Shrine, including sacristans and tech priests who do not display a specific identity tag for that day in question, as well as presenting a permission code only given on the day by an officer of the watch, can be executed outright. But there were only 2 situations where this occurred in the early establishment of the King's Guard. Since then, no attempts have been made and no incidents of note have occurred. The High King continues in leading the Knights and Hive of House Luetin, as well as its star system of Riva. So that's really the meat of my unofficial homebrew background to the Knights of House Luetin. But there remains more to explore in this homemade narrative. As you can probably tell, I've woven multiple forces into this background. The Knights of House Luetin are but one part. For those who recall the first video, I've also structured in and in fact already built a sizable Sororitas army based upon the later history of this world, and they are supported by what are known as the 9th Army. There's a whole additional description of the human forces in this time and the emergence of a very unusual trait among their militia force, plus the specialised operatives of the Karas. For the Sororitas, I'm hoping to get many more of that force painted next year, and that may form the basis for another video. But I do also have this second contingent of knights planned as well. Maybe there could be some off-world campaign I might imagine for them. The Imperial Guard 9th Army is something that I may consider down the line, as I also have an Inquisition force on the to-do list. But I wanted to note that, interestingly, you might assume, oh, the 9th Army Luetin, we get it, Luetin 09, 9th Army. Well, in the short story of Deathwolf, the planet Luetin in fact carries, unbelievably, a regiment known as the 109th Rifles 09, which is mind-blowing to me still. The plan overall is that for every remaining aspect of this background to create some kind of physical army off the back of it, which seems to suggest at some point I would have to make an orc army, which is a terrifying prospect for somebody who enjoys customizing their miniatures. Still though, this is after all what creating any backdrop to a force is about. It adds flavour, it helps you to plan and even design the aesthetic and the colour scheme for a force, as I've said several times. Speaking of which, let us get a better look at the Knights of House Luetin. seeing these knights come to fruition with the help of Siege Studios has been a truly awesome project. The level of detail from the weathering, the custom freehand artwork, the decals here done by Scumbag Customs, check them out on Instagram, all of it has been awesome and greatly enjoyable. I'm incredibly happy with the force. Another aspect to it was of course magnetizing many weapon options, and you can see those contained here in my inquisitorial case that I keep for exactly containing all of these different elements and for other miniatures that I have. Whenever I work with Siege Studios, and I think you can see this in the result, one of the things that they are extremely good at is the consistency and the continuity between projects. And that goes for the communication as well as the artist's ability to actually understand the brief and what you are trying to achieve out of this. Especially when this force was based off of a model which I had already painted myself, which was the Castigator Knight, and they took that concept, matched the colours and produced this entire force from that. But this army is already a motivating element for me, because one of the reasons I actually wanted to get this force done was so that I could play games with it, which has already happened. You can see Marnius Calgar here being caught between 4 knights having a gigantic battle, which ended up with the 2 Castellans kicking each other to death. It was really fun. It was great to get my first game of 10th in pretty recently, and I want to do that also with the Necron force, which Siege have contributed to, as well as me doing some of those models, the Sororitas in the future. But this has been just an amazing project. I want to thank Siege Studios so much for helping me with this. Hopefully it's inspired you guys. Go check them out, siegestudios.co.uk.